If you're the kind of person who lights a campfire just for the marshmallows, this one's for you. Today, I'm making rich, chocolatey s'mores cupcakes layered with graham cracker crusts, filled with gooey ganache, and crowned with swirly, toasted marshmallow meringue. Yes, it's a cupcake, but it's also a whole summer memory in a wrapper. The first time I made these, it was for a backyard gathering with a group of kids. They devoured them in minutes, and I knew this recipe was a keeper. Let's jump in, and I'll walk you through every step like we're baking together in my kitchen. We start with the crust because, let's be honest, the buttery graham layer is half the magic of a good s'more. I used 7 graham crackers, broke them into chunks, and sealed them in a large Ziploc bag. This part is a great job for kids, by the way. My daughter loves crushing them. It's loud, it's fun, and it feels a little rebellious. Then I took my rolling pin and smashed them into fine crumbs. It's actually pretty satisfying, kind of like edible stress relief after a long day. And if you don't have a rolling pin, use a wine bottle, just saying, multitasking at its finest. And hear me out, a clean meat tenderizing hammer works surprisingly well too. Just be gentle and maybe skip the spike side, unless you want some seriously rustic crumbs. Once the crumbs were finely ground, I cut a corner off the bag and poured them into a glass mixing bowl. I measured out exactly 1 1/4 cups of crumbs. Next, I added 3 tablespoons of brown sugar. This gives the crust a richer, deeper flavor, kind of like caramel without the fuss. I've tried skipping the sugar once to cut corners. Never again. It's just not the same. Then I poured in 3 tablespoons of melted butter. If you don't know an easy way to melt butter, I have a blog post about that, where I share 3 ways how to do this. With a spatula, I stirred everything together until all the crumbs were coated and started clumping like wet sand. I lined my cupcake pan with gold foil cupcake liners. These liners are great because they hold their shape and don't soak through like paper ones. Also, they look so pretty. It feels like you're dressing your cupcakes in evening gowns. And don't worry about memorizing all the tools or ingredients I'm using. I'll leave the full list in the description below. No need to grab a pen or try to screenshot everything mid-video. Using a dough scoop, I added about 1.5 tablespoons of crust into each liner, then pressed it down with the back of a spoon until flat. Since the first time I baked these cupcakes though, I've discovered a much easier way. Just use the bottom of a measuring cup to flatten the crust. It's faster, more even, and way easier on the wrists. Trust me. I baked the crusts in a preheated oven at 325 degrees Fahrenheit, 165 degrees Celsius, for exactly 7 minutes. Then I set the tray aside to cool completely while I prepped the rest. Here's a tip. If you're short on time, you can bake the crusts the day before and store the whole tray in the fridge. I've done that many times during holiday season prep marathons. And honestly, there's no reason to do everything in one day. Spread it out, enjoy the process, and keep it stress-free. In a medium bowl, I whisked together the dry ingredients. First went in 1 cup of all-purpose flour, then half a cup of unsweetened cocoa powder, and yes, I always sifted. Cocoa clumps are the pranksters of the baking world, silent, sneaky, and always showing up when you least want them. Next, a 1/4 teaspoon of salt, the quiet background singer that makes every other flavor pop. Then half a teaspoon of baking soda and 1 teaspoon of baking powder to give our cupcakes that nice lift. I whisk everything together to break up any clumps and make sure all the dry ingredients are blended evenly. You can absolutely use a fork for this step if that's your style, or even a large sifter for an extra fine mix. I personally can't live without my hand whisk. I've got a drawer full of them in all shapes and sizes. Yes, it might be a borderline obsession, but hey, being a food photographer means I get a free pass for hoarding whisks, like they're going out of style. All in the name of props, of course. Alright, moving on. In a separate large bowl, I cracked in 2 large eggs. I like to let them come to room temperature first. It helps everything mix more evenly. Next, I poured in 1/3 cup of vegetable oil. You could use melted butter, but I find oil makes a softer, moister cupcake. Bonus, no waiting for butter to soften. Then I added 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract. I'm generous with vanilla. Even a tiny bit more adds so much warmth. In goes 1 cup of granulated sugar. No shortcuts. Here, we want sweet and structured. Then I added 1/2 cup of buttermilk. I keep a small carton in the fridge during baking season. You can also make your own by adding 1 tablespoon vinegar to milk and letting it sit. I whisked the wet ingredients until well blended. I'm using my large whisk for this job. It's one of those trusty tools that just feels right in your hand. And really, there's no need for electric mixers here unless you're trying to show off your stand mixer collection. The reason I stick with a whisk is simple. It gives me more control, and it's way too easy to get carried away with electric mixers and overmix the eggs. We're blending, not building muscle. Save the heavy-duty tools for bread dough. Then I added the dry ingredients in thirds, whisking after each addition. I'm careful not to overmix. We want fluffy cupcakes, not chewy muffins. Using my dough scoop, aka my cupcake batter hero, I portioned the batter over the cooled graham crusts, filling each liner about 3/4 full. I love using a dough scoop because it keeps everything uniform, which means your cupcakes will all bake evenly and look like adorable little twins. Plus, it's less messy than spooning batter and trying to guess if each one is the same size. Honestly, once you start scooping, you never go back. I baked them at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, 175 degrees Celsius, for 18 minutes. Your kitchen will smell like a chocolate dream. I let them cool completely before the fun part, filling and frosting. While the cupcakes are cooling, let's talk about that part too, because it's more important than most people think. I know it's tempting to rush ahead and start decorating, but letting the cupcakes cool completely ensures the ganache won't melt and the meringue won't slide off. I usually let them sit in the pan for about 5 to 10 minutes, then gently transfer them to a cooling rack. If your kitchen is chilly, set the rack near your oven or in a draft-free zone so they don't get shocked by a sudden temperature drop. And if you're planning to bake ahead, feel free to let them cool completely, then store them covered at room temp until you're ready to fill and frost. Trust me, trying to frost a warm cupcake is a sticky mistake I've made and regretted. The ganache is basically the soul of the cupcake. It's the kind of filling that makes people stop mid-bite and ask, "Wait, what is this deliciousness?" In a small saucepan, I added 1/3 cup of heavy cream and warmed it over medium-low heat just until it started to steam, not boil. Then I removed it from the heat and poured it over 1 cup of chocolate chips in a glass mixing bowl. I let it sit for about 30 seconds, then stirred slowly with a spatula until the mixture turned glossy and completely smooth. I transferred the ganache to a piping bag, secured the top with a piping tie, and set it aside to cool and thicken slightly while I made the cupcake batter. Sometimes, if I'm baking on a cooler day and the ganache thickens too fast, I place the piping bag in a warm mug of water, tip side up, to loosen it again. It's a tiny trick that works every time. Also, pro tip: if you don't have a piping bag, just spoon the ganache into the cupcakes. I promise the ganache police won't come knocking. In a clean, heat-proof bowl, I combined 4 egg whites, 1 cup of sugar, 1/2 teaspoon of cream of tartar, and 1 teaspoon of vanilla. I set the bowl over a saucepan of simmering water, double boiler style, making sure it didn't touch the water. Then I whisk for 5 to 7 minutes until the sugar dissolved and it reached 140 degrees Fahrenheit or 60 degrees Celsius. If you've never made a double boiler before, don't worry. I've got a separate video where I show you exactly how to do it step by step. It's super simple, and once you learn it, you'll use it all the time for chocolate, meringue, and more. During those few minutes of whisking, I like to keep the motion steady and smooth. No need to whip aggressively yet. Just keep things moving so the sugar dissolves evenly. You'll know it's ready when the mixture looks a little glossy and feels totally smooth when you rub a tiny bit between your fingers. Now is the part where you want to get out your kitchen power tools. Trust me, you need them here. I'm using a hand mixer because that's what most people have in their kitchens. But if you have a stand mixer, bring it on. This is its moment to shine. Once I transferred the bowl to the stand mixer fitted with the whisk attachment, I beat the mixture on high for about 6 to 7 minutes, watching it go from a warm, syrupy liquid to glossy, snow-white peaks is seriously one of my favorite transformations in baking. It's like a magic trick, except edible. If you're using a hand mixer, it might take a couple minutes longer, but totally doable. And if you're feeling brave or your mixer has mysteriously stopped working, yes, you can whip it by hand. Just make sure you've cleared your schedule and stretched first. It's basically a full upper body workout. You've been warned. Baking cupcakes at high altitude is a bit like baking on expert mode. Things rise too fast, dry out too quickly, or collapse just when you start feeling confident. It's like the cupcakes are playing a prank on you. I struggled with high altitude baking for a while. Let me tell you, it was a journey of trial and error and a lot of sunken cupcakes. But don't worry, with a few simple tweaks, you can still achieve perfectly fluffy, moist, and delicious cupcakes. Here's how to make it happen. Adjust the flour. At high altitudes, cupcakes can puff up too quickly and then sink like a souffle that just got bad news. To help prevent this, I add 1 to 2 extra tablespoons of flour per cup used in the recipe. This helps stabilize the structure and keeps the cupcake standing tall. Tweak the leavening agents. Because there's less air pressure, baking powder and baking soda can get a little too enthusiastic, causing cupcakes to overinflate and then collapse. I reduce the amount by about 25% to keep things under control. Boost the liquid. The air is drier up here, which means moisture vanishes faster than I'd like. To keep cupcakes from turning into hockey pucks, I increase the liquid, milk, water, or buttermilk, by 1 to 2 tablespoons per cup used in the recipe. This helps keep the batter properly hydrated. Add an extra eggs provide structure and moisture, two things high-altitude baking loves to mess with. Adding one extra egg helps bind everything together and prevents the cupcakes from crumbling apart. Turn up the heat, just a little. Because liquids evaporate faster, I increase the oven temperature by 15 to 25 degrees Fahrenheit, about 5 to 10 degrees Celsius, and slightly reduce the baking time. This helps the cupcakes set faster before they have a chance to dry out. Dial back the sugar. Sugar weakens the structure of cupcakes, and at high altitudes, that's the last thing I want. I reduce the sugar by 1 to 2 tablespoons per cup to keep things balanced and avoid cupcakes that spread too much or collapse. Fill cupcake liners just right. Since things tend to rise a little differently up here, I only fill cupcake liners about half to 2/3 full. This prevents overflow and ensures they bake evenly. Go easy on the mixing. Overmixing adds too much air to the batter, which can make cupcakes rise too fast and then sink, kind of like my motivation to do the dishes after baking. I stir just until everything is combined. No need to go overboard. Watch the clock haksha. High altitude cupcakes bake faster than their sea level cousins. I check for doneness a few minutes earlier than usual by inserting a toothpick in the center. If it comes out clean or with just a few crumbs, they're ready. Keep them fresh. Dry air equals dry cupcakes. To keep them from turning stale too fast, I store them in an airtight container at room temperature for a day or two, or refrigerate them if I need them to last long. With these simple adjustments, high-altitude baking doesn't have to feel like a challenge, more like a fun science experiment, but with way better rewards. Because let's face it, cupcakes beat test tubes, and instead, it's just another excuse to bake more cupcakes. Because, let's be honest, I'm always up for that.
Thank you.
By this point, the cupcakes should be nice and cool, and now we're ready for the grand finale. This is where it all comes together. Graham cracker crust, rich chocolate cupcake, creamy ganache, and fluffy toasted marshmallow. Honestly, it's the dessert version of a standing ovation. I like to take a moment here, maybe sip some tea or coffee, and admire how far we've come, and also prepare for the very fun, slightly messy job ahead. To get started, I used an apple corer to cut a neat little cone-shaped pocket out of each cupcake. It's quick, clean, and, let's be real, kind of fun. There's something oddly satisfying about pulling out the center in one smooth move. Set that middle piece aside. Seriously, don't eat it or toss it just yet. I know it's tempting. You'll need it in just a second to seal the ganache pocket like a sweet little trapdoor. If you don't have an apple corer, don't worry. A small paring knife works just fine. Just carefully carve out a cone-shaped piece by hand. It takes a tiny bit longer, but it does the job beautifully. I've done it both ways, depending on what's clean and available. Then I grabbed my piping bag, filled with that glossy ganache, snipped off a small tip, not too big, you want a slow and steady flow, and filled each cupcake pocket. The trick here is not to overfill. If it looks like it might overflow, stop right there. A little ganache goes a long way, and we want a surprise bite, not a ganache explosion. Once filled, I popped the cake lid back on top like a tiny little cupcake hat. Pressed gently, no squishing, and moved on to the next. And if one breaks or crumbles a little, don't stress. That's why we have frosting coming up. It's not just delicious, it's also the cupcake version of makeup. It hides everything. I scooped generous dollops of the meringue onto each cupcake using a regular spoon. Nothing fancy here. Just grab what you have and pile it high. The meringue is thick and forgiving, and the spoon lets you control exactly how much you want on each one. Plus, you get those fun, imperfect swirls that make each cupcake look a little different in the best way. If you're wondering whether you need a piping bag for this, don't worry. I find the spoon actually gives me a more organic, cloud-like shape. Think of it like frosting freestyle. Every swirl and peak has its own personality. And the best part? It's a no-pressure process. If you mess up, just add a little more and pretend you meant to do it. Using my favorite cake spatula, I swirled the tops like I was painting marshmallow clouds. I like to make swooping motions and dramatic little flicks. It adds volume and makes the final torching even prettier. There's no perfect way to do this. The more drama in the swirl, the better the toast looks later. And if you don't have a cake spatula like I do, just grab a good old butter knife. It gets the job done. And honestly, the meringue won't judge. This part is also a great place to slow down and enjoy the process. Play some music, Take your time and let yourself have a little fun. I've even had friends join in on this step before. It turns into a bit of a cupcake art session. Now, for the best part, I toasted the peaks with a kitchen torch until they were golden and just a tiny bit crispy. That warm, toasted marshmallow smell fills the kitchen and instantly takes you back to bonfire nights. If you don't have a torch, you can pop them under the broiler for a few seconds. Just don't walk away. Ask me how I learned that lesson. Hint, it involved a smoke alarm, some frantic waving, and a very confused cat. Did you know cupcakes have been making life sweeter for over 2 centuries? The first time someone wrote about them was way back in 1796 in an American cookbook, where they were called a light cake to be baked in small cups. And get this, before cupcake liners and pans were a thing, people actually baked them in teacups. How fancy is that? The name cupcake really took off in the 19th century, and it had a double meaning. Some used the name because the cakes were literally baked in cups, while others used it to describe recipes that measured ingredients by the cup instead of weighing them. Either way, they made baking a whole lot easier. No need to bust out the kitchen scale. By the 20th century, cupcakes were everywhere. Birthday parties, school events, and bake sales. Then, in the early 2000s, things got serious. Shows like Sex and the City helped make fancy cupcake bakeries a trend. And suddenly, cupcakes weren't just a quick dessert. They became a whole experience. Now, with endless flavors, fillings, and decorations, cupcakes are still stealing the spotlight in bakeries and home kitchens around the world. This part is totally optional. The cupcakes are already delicious and basically begging to be eaten. But me, being the overachiever and cereal embellisher that I am, just couldn't resist adding a little pizzazz. So I decorated them with homemade mini chocolate bars and tiny star-shaped graham crackers. Yes, I went full Pinterest mode. Now, I'd love to pretend I always have these stashed in my fridge, ready to grab like some kind of dessert magician. But let's be honest, I made them specifically for these cupcakes a few days ago and planned it like a tiny dessert production schedule. I even made a checklist twice. But hey, the result? Totally worth it. They add that little something extra that makes everyone go, wait, you made those too? If you want to get fancy too, I've linked the recipes for both in the description below. Because if we're going over the top, we might as well do it together. And don't worry, they're easier than they look. Sometimes I let the kids decorate the tops, and we end up with everything from sprinkles to googly candy eyes. Totally not traditional, but ridiculously fun. It's part baking, part craft hour, part chaos. And somehow, those cupcakes are always the first ones to disappear. And that's it. Gooey, chocolatey, meringue-topped S'mores cupcakes that taste like summer and look like you bought them at a fancy bakery. Only better, because they're homemade. You've got buttery graham crusts, rich chocolate cake, a hidden pool of ganache, and that toasty cloud-like meringue frosting, all in one perfect little wrapper. Honestly, it's like a campfire treat went to pastry school. If you make these, I'd absolutely love to see your creations. Tag me or drop a comment below. Did you go full torch mode or play it safe with the broiler? Did you keep it elegant or did the kids go rogue with the toppings? Either way, I want the details, messy meringue swirls and all. And if you're planning to make these ahead or take them to a party, don't forget you can store the frosted cupcakes in a covered container at room temp for a few hours. Just make sure they've fully cooled first, or you'll end up with a frosting slide situation. Been there, frosted that. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more baking adventures with a cozy, slightly chaotic twist. Thanks for hanging out in the kitchen with me, and happy, happy cupcakes.